Keep the first slide. Okay, welcome everybody to the session. This is about an update on the European Interoperability Framework. I get the feeling that I'm speaking to the converted when it comes to EIF. On one hand, because of the history of EIF, and on the other hand, because of the great use case that Inspire in its context gives to the interoperability and to the existing frameworks in this context. So as you heard, I'm Adrian Dusha. I'm the Deputy Head of Unit of the Interoperability Unit in DG Digit of the European Commission. As I said, EIF is not something new. It's something that exists for quite a while now, and its history is very much intertwined with the one of our ISA2 program. We do have this concern since the early 2000s of capturing in a framework the concepts of interoperability, and not only that, but to give them some practical solutions. So we can trace back to the first version of the European Interoperability Framework that was quite a groundbreaking paper in itself, giving a mark and a reference to people that were thinking about how to work better together across not only the European Union, but indeed across the globe. Then we moved on with a new version of the EIF, and then last year, in March, we saw the adoption of the third revision of the EIF, and I will try to walk through that, and then my colleagues will develop parts of its context or model into the next speeches. Why would we care about all this? We care because we looked at different indicators that we have in the EU, for example, and when looking at the digital public services and the level of digitization, we do see there is a correlation between the way countries score in NIFO, which is our National Interoperability Framework Observatory, and DESI, so the indicator for digitization of public services. And this leads us to believe that there is a way of improving the level of digitization by making sure the interoperability principles are observed, and the other way around, should we want to have more interoperable public services, digitizing them, it's a good way forward. So, as I said, we do make good progress on this. We have the ISA2 program that is supporting very much the principles of the interoperability framework, and as such, funding actions that at some point even turn into solutions which are ready to go, and that span a large number of sectors. Our main concern is bridging not only across borders, but also going across sectors. And you see also here we have the example of course, of the Inspire directive. As I said, it's a very good context for us, giving us a way of looking at interoperability in all its levels. And which are these levels? Are the four levels of interoperability that are indicated in the European Interoperability Framework in conjunction with the conceptual model. This is the backbone or the pillar of the interoperability framework, which is augmented then by the levels of interoperability, which I will mention in a bit. We have the 12 underlying principles and the 47 recommendations. As I said, it's version 3. It got to a point where there are very pragmatic things, solutions that you can put in place in your context, no matter what that context is, in order to remove the barriers for interoperability. And I will go a bit through the context, but not before saying that European Interoperability Framework in its history got an extra boost in October 2017 with the signature of the Ministerial Declaration on e-government in Tallinn, where it was mentioned that the member states, through their representatives, have reconfirmed their commitment to the principles and implementation of the European Interoperability Framework, which is very important, not only because there are very important people who said that, but it's also because this brings the principles of the framework to the heart of the effort of digitally transforming the public administrations in Europe. And indeed, you see there the 5 principles of the declaration, of the Tallinn Declaration, where you have interoperability by default as one of the main ones. So what this gives us? This gives us a way to look at the context of European interactions at all levels, as I said, in a way that is more structured. So by looking at how a public service is mapped as reference to the conceptual model of EIF, and then how it implements the different provisions of the EIF. And then it's I will go a bit into the EIF structure. Am I speaking very loud or no? Okay, it's because I have the feeling that it's very strong in my head. So we have these 4 layers of interoperability, which have. Is okay? Okay. I will start from the bottom up, and that is because this is what we observe in many contexts. So it's not, we were not the first ones, I think, to look at the interoperability and how to tackle this in the best way. We see this happening over and over again, unfortunately, but most people, they do tend to stop at the first 2 layers. So we are always concerned about having 2 systems talking to each other, so having the connection between the 2 of them. And once we have the connection, we realize that we also have to care about the semantic interoperability, so making sure that whatever is meant by yellow in one, it's yellow on the other one. But then what we are doing with the EIF, we are going beyond that, and we are looking at how 2 organizations can put in place frameworks by which they can collaborate and interoperate. And then even further, we are looking at whether there are any laws or any legislation at all levels of legislation that can pose a barrier. So just to give you an example, should there be a piece of law that says that a central database will be implemented for monitoring or reporting on something, it is creating already a way that could hamper, in some cases, the interoperability. So I will go one step deeper into the EIF. As I said, there are 12 underlying principles, which are grouped as follow. I will not go into the details all of them, but it's only to show the orthogonality of this, of the European Interoperability Framework with other work that we are doing, and here I can refer to the EGOV action plan or to, indeed, the Tallinn Declaration that we have just mentioned earlier. So as you see, the principles are finding their way back in all this work, leading to a correct positioning of the projects or activities that happen in those contexts. We do have the conceptual model, which is a very interesting pillar and giving a backbone to the EIF, because, as I said, there is, when we look at this, this gives a link between the digitization efforts and the interoperability efforts. So by making sure that we can identify the pieces of the conceptual model into the public service, this allows us to go back afterwards and look at how interoperable that public service is. And by doing that, we can put in place a benchmarking or even cookbooks, best practices for delivering better public services. And I will end on this note. I think I went very fast to the sides. And here it's only to say that 1 year since the update of the EIF, what do we have? We have work started, and this is where I will pass to Miguel for the next presentation on the monitoring for the new EIF. But what we have, we also mapped in the process of drafting of the new EIF, we mapped all the expectations that several stakeholders, both from public administration, but also from academia and research organizations, have on the areas that EIF can help with. what would you see as improving the moment that the implementation of EIF happens? And I think I will close on this thing. So this is a moment where we can take some questions or we can speak more at a later stage.
Is there any question? Yeah, Fritz.
Ray Boguslavsky from the European Commission, working on an ISA action, ISA squared action. Actually, my question possibly crosses over from your presentation and Miguel's presentation. 76% NIFO EIF alignment seems like a big number. It seems like job done or job nearly done. When you look at the number, I mean, it's a lot higher than the percentage of people who voted for Brexit, for example. But I mean, my feeling is that the job is far from done, and I can see many aspects of the EIF that aren't being followed to any great degree across Europe, and there is so much more to do. And what is your, say, personal view on that? And maybe is it the monitoring mechanism that needs to raise the bar to create a more realistic position? I'd be interested in your thoughts and maybe Miguel's thoughts on that later.
My quite personal view is that first of all, it's an average. So what we observe there are countries or parts of Europe where the level of alignment is much higher. But of course, the bad news with an average, that means there are some which is much lower than this average. So this is on one side. The other one, it's I see several vectors for raising the bar and improving on that number. One of them, what we observed in some member states, we are now at the third iteration, but also nationally they have been doing iterations for looking at the interoperability of their public services. So we saw, at least in one member state, where they are re-evaluating. So with the exercise that we did for moving to the third revision of the EIF, they are also reviewing their own practices to take into account different balance between regional and central or local and regional and so on and so forth. So this is a mechanism, this is a vector that I see also will increase the alignment, because there is a transformation step which happens. Then indeed the digital transformation to which several I would say governments, so that can be at any level, or public administrations at all levels in Europe, their concern for the digital transformation of their public services will be another vector. As we saw, there is this correlation between digitalization and the interoperability. And again, I expect that this will push to a higher level of interoperability. And to be honest, my biggest expectation or my biggest hope for a boost in that is given by the kind of collateral product of the digital transformation is the digital transformation, it's the digital government. So it's the product of digital transformation, which is the rethinking of the way of the role of the government towards its stakeholders, citizens and businesses, which leads to thinking across sectors. This is where we'll see, because cross-border we made huge strides in the past few years. And now the cross-border is the next jump, I would say. That's my feeling.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Miguel Alvarez. I work also in DIGIT, in the European Commission, in the Interoperability Unit. My presentation is kind of a follow-up on what was mentioned earlier on by Adrian. I'm going to introduce to you what we are doing, where we stand when it comes to the implementation of the new European Interoperability Framework and the monitoring at member state level. You can see that it's a quite comprehensive framework compared to the previous one. I will guide you through the process we are undertaking right now. In this slide, basically, we are summarizing that this has been already a very long and sometimes winding road in order to reach this point where we have a more comprehensive and right-to-the-point framework instrument to promote interoperability at EU level. Initially, earlier on, we had many different steps, different milestones, also new legislation promoting indeed public administration modernization, digitization, and so on. And now we are at the point of starting the monitoring and the implementation of the EIF, because before the monitoring it comes the implementation. So basically, NIFO, the National Interoperability Framework Observatory, over the last few years is one of the main products of the ISA2 Programme. This is a national interoperability observatory where we are in a way providing the pillars to this road, to this journey to implement interoperability at EU level. First of all, by supporting the member states, analyzing what is the situation, where they stand when it comes to interoperability. So in this regard, we provide up-to-date information on a regular basis on what is the status, what is the state of the art on interoperability, what is the role that interoperability is playing when it comes to implementing better public administration services and e-government. And we have a community. We have a group of people, member state representatives that are working closely with us, also to highlight best practices and areas where there is a need to foster interoperability. In Geoinformation, you can find the collection. The collection is basically this NIFO community where you can find the products that we produce, as I said, on a regular basis, like the e-government fact sheets in 34 European countries, 28 member states plus the associated countries to the ISA2 Programme, most of them from the EFTA environment. We also produce on an annual basis a European semester study where we highlight how the member states are using the structural funds to leverage from them in order to achieve better public service delivery and to digitalize and modernize public administration. In the past, in the previous version of the EIF, we also have analytical capabilities to understand what was the level of alignment of the member states to the EIF. This figure is coming from this analysis. And we had dedicated fact sheets, NIFO fact sheets on what is the level of alignment of member states when it comes to the EIF. This is something that we will resume soon as we have the new monitoring mechanism in place. And as data sources, we are, as I said, cooperating closely with the member states. We have a network of member state correspondents or national contact points that are very helpful because they help us to gather this information. For instance, for the fact sheets where we summarize where the member states stand when it comes to e-government, new policies, and you can just have a look in the website, in Geoinformation, to fact sheets, one per member state, and also in the stand, we have handed over today a brochure, printed copies of the e-government fact sheet of Belgium. This year, we are revamping the new community of NIFO because we have this milestone as of next year, 2019, when we will start monitoring the implementation of the EIF and when we will have solid results to present to the group of experts and the general public interested in this topic. So the priorities are just to continue with the regular digital government studies, more oriented to policymakers to understand how member states are dealing with interoperability and e-government. We are trying to revamp, as I said, the collection and the NIFO community by introducing new features. In the monitoring mechanism is going to be one of these features, since we need to create a dashboard with composite indicators to present the partial and the overall results per member states on how they are aligning and implementing the EIF. We also are working in the concept of providing some learning material for the officials of the member states to help them to understand what is the EIF and how they can use the EIF back at home to implement better interoperability policies and projects, and also to reach out the regional and the local governments to support them in this road. What is the most challenging part for us? We are just in principle in contact with national authorities, but we have sometimes difficulties just to pass the message through to these local and regional authorities. That's the reason why we are working along with the member states in defining the concept of EIF ambassadors, and also what kind of supporting material we can give to them, like training material, to support them to go back home and to raise awareness on interoperability, and also to facilitate the implementation of the principles and recommendations of the EIF. So this is in a nutshell what we are trying to do this year. I'm just very shortly, to conclude my presentation, jumping into the monitoring of the EIF. Basically, I would like just to introduce you to this topic. Article 1.2 of the ISA2 decision clearly states that the Commission, through the ISA2 program, will monitor the implementation of this framework, the European Interoperability Framework. So we have a very strong, let's say, supporting legal material to carry out with this vision. And the mission is to establish the degree of implementation. In the previous EIF, we were only measuring the level of alignment of the national interoperability frameworks or e-government policies to the EIF. That's the reason sometimes the results, the scores were very high, because we were checking that in the legal framework of each member state, at least these principles were recognized. But now, in a way, the implementation of the EIF implies implementing practical recommendations, those presented earlier on in a nutshell by my colleague Yusa. These recommendations sometimes are very right to the point, are touching different sectors with different domains, a lot of public services. So the challenge now is to implement not only the principles, also the particular recommendations, the 47 recommendations. So the goal here is to establish the degree of implementation of the EIF through a series of measurements. We are defining primary and secondary indicators. And the goal is indeed to provide member states with a kind of diagnosis on what is the level of implementation, what are the areas that require an improvement, what are the gaps, and how to solve those gaps for better public service delivery. So the mechanism, the monitoring mechanism, is composed of primary indicators and secondary indicators. We are going to reuse as much as possible existing indicators and monitoring mechanisms established already at EU level by defining EU policies, not to reinvent the wheel. The 47 recommendations are very much cross-cutting, are touching all different sectors and sometimes very specific policies like the IDAS regulation and so on. So we are not going to oblige member states to provide the same information again. We have to respect the one's only principle also at home. So secondary indicators will be reused as much as possible, but we are also defining primary indicators. We need to monitor things that didn't exist before. That's the reason why we are just analyzing what kind of indicators, KPIs are needed. The benefit, the idea here is not to name and shame. It's basically to gain intelligence for the Commission and also for the member states on what are the processes in place to improve interoperability and service delivery and what could improve. And this way, member states can also obtain concrete measurements on the level of the EIF implementation. We want to reuse, as said, the existing indicators in order to streamline the evaluation process and in a way to consolidate information that nowadays is a bit scattered through different policy areas. And this input is going to be, first of all, very valuable for us, for the ISA2 program, to plan in advance what direction this program should take in the future, how we could better support member states in this endeavor to implement and to support the implementation of interoperability and better e-government policies. Also to analyze internally in the Commission, along with the member states, what kind of potential synergies could be found across different policy areas where there is a need to implement further efforts for better public service delivery. And in a way, the underlying principle is to put in value what is the role of interoperability when it comes to public administration modernization. Finally, to conclude my presentation, we can see here the kind of secondary data sources that will be part of this monitoring mechanism of the European Interoperability Framework, major policies, existing monitoring mechanism like the DESI indicators, like the CEF Connecting Europe Facility monitoring dashboard, and we are obviously closely working with the colleagues of INSPIRE, Jersey, because LIFO, they are defining a location interoperability framework observatory. This is going to be captured, obviously, as a secondary data source that will be consolidated in our monitoring mechanism for the EIF. So this is in a nutshell the presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
I'm Saulis Urbanas from Eurogeographics, the Association of National Mapping Cadastral Authorities. One of the aspects of interoperability that we have been working for many years, this is the cross-border interoperability between one country to another country, sticking features, assuring that we have a homogeneous networks of rivers and roads, railroads. So we have been working with the members on so-called edge matching guidance. So how to make the connecting feature that crosses the another country. So, but the whole this work is actually made on kind of voluntary basis. When one country need to agree with the neighboring country on aspects, they are sticking one feature with another feature, and the techniques we recommend and define as a guidance to follow are only the recommendations. So no any power to force and no political influence on whatever process that to be done. Of course, it's very important when you're having pan-European data sets that it look nice, and but also it's important that it has a relation with the national production of the spatial data and maintenance and updates. Have you any thoughts on these practical measures that would help actually achieving this edge match picture of the spatial data in Europe?
That's a very interesting question. In ISA2 Programme, indeed, we have this vision in place. All the solutions that we are implementing, the idea is that they can be used across borders, and sometimes we have pilots with member states, neighboring member states, indeed, to prove that these solutions, data sets, could work well across borders. The EIF, in principle, is an instrument that I see it as an incremental approach, a stepwise approach. In order to be interoperable across borders, first of all, you need to implement some interoperability principles back at home. And this is the idea that we are promoting. If you look at the recommendations and the principles of the EIF, they are very much in this logic. Use open data, work on semantic interoperability by implementing European or international standards. So in the first place, in the first years, it's going to be very difficult to measure the cross-border dimension of the implementation of the EIF. What we are going to measure is more how the member states are doing things within their borders. But by implementing sound interoperability principles and these sound recommendations, in the long run, this cross-border dimension will be there. Having said that, what we are doing in parallel, and this is what I said earlier on, we are supporting member states in all of our actions with some cross-border pilots. And all our products, frameworks, solutions, applications could work well in a cross-border domain. In my field, for instance, I'm working on catalog of public services, and indeed, we have created data sets, and we have already cross-border pilots, for instance, between Estonia and Finland, and also in Belgium, to use a common data set to federate the information from the different repositories of the different Belgian regions in a federal state like Belgium. So we are working, let's say, in parallel, but the EIF in the first round is more oriented to monitor how the member states are doing at home. The cross-border dimension is something that we need to think about it in the medium term. In the short term, I don't think we can yet be there, because it's very challenging for the member states, honestly. During these first 2 years, it will be very challenging for the member states to fully implement the EIF back at home. So this is, in my view, the first challenge and the first support we need to give them to support them to implement the EIF, but at the same time, it's in the spirit of the EIF, definitely the cross-border dimension. And for instance, when it comes to EID, the recommendations related to the EID are linked to major policies like the IDAS regulation, which is already a cross-border piece of legislation for the mutual recognition of EIDs. So depending on the recommendation, the cross-border dimension will be there, or it will have to be incorporated in years to come.
Yes, I'm Pascal Horry from the Ecological and Sustainable Ministry, in France. And yes, you said it's not really connected with the ISA, but there are some links with, I will explain it later. I'm sorry for the person who were attending the session this morning. I recognize some faces, but 2 or 3 slides will be exactly the same as this morning, but don't be afraid, it's only 12 slides, so 10 minutes, it will be over. Please note the name of this working group I will talk about is GMEL, but it's only meaningful in French. It's about sea and shore, in fact. The presentation has been prepared with Pierre Vignier, who is not here today. He is working for CEREMA. It's a public body in France. He is a senior engineer, expert on shore and sea. Very quickly, the scope of my presentation. I will first recall the features of the working group. The first task of the working group, which was to identify core reference data sets, and I will focus on some topic, SIGGRID reference system, not the coastline, because I talked about coastlines this morning, but the shore orthophotography and then the perspective. It's a very operational presentation. So the features of the working group, it has been launched in 2016. Previously there was a group in 2011, 2015, but it ended in 2015 because we had no funds for funding our product. We had right specification. The goals of the group is to identify core reference data sets, and in order to support public policies. But we don't only write specifications of the product. We also try to create the condition of the funding of the production. So it's very operational. And you see it's identify a right specification in order to support public policies. So it's all about sharing and all about reusing the data. So here is a connection with the speakers, the previous speakers. The group is a very active group. We have numerous stakeholders. Every meeting we have 20 to 30 people, mainly from the public sector, local authorities, state at different levels, regional, national, and public bodies like the French Mapping Agency and hydrographic and oceanographic agency too. We have the CNIJ legitimacy. The CNIJ is the INSPIRE coordinating structure in France. So we are connected to the CNIJ. Every standard we write is labelized by the CNIJ, and we have the state support because the state funds the managing of the group. So the first task of the group was to identify core reference data sets. So we have done it. Mainly, we identified 3 types of data sets: jurisdictional boundaries, ecosystem data sets linked to pressure and use, and data sets useful for reporting to the EU. In the end, we identified 100 core reference data sets, and among them, 40 was connected with regulations. Of course, there's reliance links between all these data sets. For instance, to create the geomorphological coastline, we need a shore or soil photography before. So there's this kind of links. We identify priority rules for output, and in the end, we delivered a full array with identified data sets, and it's available on the web. Here is a picture we published a few years ago. It's useful for explaining the different boundaries we can find on the shore and the sea. And some of these boundaries are in free access in open data on this website, limitmaritime.gouv.fr. One of the first focus of our group was to determine a sea grid reference system. The goal was to have a continuous and regular grid on the sea domain to allow data analysis to cross the data, in fact. So we produced a layer compliant, of course, with INSPIRE and other existing sea grid like FAO grid. The grid is 1 degree minute per 1 degree minute, and only offshore mainland France. It covers only offshore mainland France by now, and it's downloadable on this website, geolittoral.developmentdurable.gouv.fr. We also published a brochure to explain how we designed the grid. It's also available on the web, and we are planning to produce this grid also on overseas French territories. Here is a picture, an example of how do we use this grid. It's occurrences of scallop fishing areas by boat dredges in the channel between France and England. Just an example. We also focused on shore or soil photography. I think everybody knows here what a soil photography is, but shore or soil photography is a very specific one. The first edition of this sort of photography was in 2000, just following the Erika shipwreck on the Brittany coast. We produced a second one in 2011, and in 2017 we led a survey targeting professional users to identify the different users and needs of this shore also photography. We got a lot of answers, more than 200. It was really useful, and the main finding of the survey was the shore also photography is very useful in every public policy linked to the shore. So that was a huge satisfaction for us. Following this, we led a technical review to ease the shape of the further product specification. In fact, the specification of this third edition will be very, very close to the second edition. So we have to get pictures with aircraft at a low tide. So the water height is less than 1 meter. It's very important, and it's not so easy to get aerial pictures with this specification less than 1 meter, especially in some areas where you have huge tide, like in between Normandy and Brittany. It covers all the Atlantic shore between Belgian and Spanish borders, so it's all the Atlantic shore of France, not the Mediterranean Sea, because the tide is only 50 centimeters, so it's not useful. And it covers foreshore until isolated spits or barrier islands, estuaries, bays, ponds, and dunes. Here you have a picture of this shore also photography. It's a use case. We use this data sets for aquaculture cadastre. More about specification. It's the pictures are in red, green, blue, and also in color infrared too. The pixel is 50 centimeter ground resolution, and we try to reduce the cliff shade, especially on Normandy coast, because there's huge cliff. And we need to have the bottom of the cliff, because most of the time you have the coastline, which is just at the bottom of the cliff. So the aircraft has to fly just in parallel of the cliff. So it's another constraint for the aircraft company. The geographical coverage is about 31 square kilometers, and the budget is between 6,000 and 7,000 euros, so it's a huge budget. Mainly because of the constraints on the aircraft, the moment for to get good pictures. Of course, these data sets are downloadable in free access, open data. It's the case of the edition 1 and 2, and it will be the case for the third edition. We have opportunities, European fundings with the European Maritime and Fishery Fund. So probably, I don't know, it's possible that it will be funded by the European Union. And we got another opportunity this summer because the French Mapping Agency is setting up aircraft flight mission in French Guiana. And so we took this opportunity for an extent of 5,000 square kilometers on French Guiana at a marginal cost. So the aircraft are now in French Guiana. But for mainland France, the first flight is scheduled in spring 2019. So here is a use case of the this shore ocean photography for identifying reef grass beds, Posidonia meadow, seaweed beds, etc. It's very useful. Perspective, we have now two groups which are working on harbors, boundaries, and sea fishing regulatory data. So, but it's only the beginning for these two groups. Thank you for your attention.